Boker Tov, Rabbi Kahn.
Good morning.
So I wanted to, last time we had a Parsha discussion. It was in Bereshit, Parshat Bereshit, Sefer Bereshit. And you had mentioned Yosef, who is in our Parsha, this in connection to Cain and Havel, when you asked the question, Hashomer achi anochi, am I my brother's keeper? And you had responded that yes, indeed, you are your brother's keeper. You are responsible for your brother. And of course, that ties in it's very pertinent to what's about to happen in our Parsha in Vayeishev, where actually Yaakov Avinu appoints Yosef as the keeper of his brothers when he sends him out and says, go check on your brothers who are shepherding the flock in Shechem. I mean, I think it starts before then,
Right.
when he's reporting on them and he brings back Dibatam Ra, whatever, he brings back a bad report. But in terms of us seeing that it was Yaakov officially who said to go look, that's where it begins. And so, you had brought up that it's important to be able to move enough away from the self in order to let in the other person, to have this unity. And here, Yaakov is supposed to be his brother's keeper, so to speak, but I think it's obviously not just that. Yes,
Yaakov or Yosef?
I meant Yosef, sorry. Yosef, but obviously it's not just being keeper, it's how you do it, when you do it, and things started to go wrong because of this, because of his trying to be a keeper for his brother at the beginning of the exile. So obviously it wasn't done, I don't think, in the way that you meant or the way that it's intended to be. And so I wanted to first open this conversation to culpability and where does it lie, and what you think, and what you have to say about that topic.
What's that topic? You mean how? Because there are a lot of layers to this. The question is, how does the Cain and Hevel story impact the Yosef and brother stories? So I'll say right then, on many, many levels, on literary levels, on thematic levels. I mean, you have the divide between the farmer versus the shepherd. And over here, you have the brothers who are shepherds, but Yosef who dreams of being a farmer. And that's what the content of part of his dream, which means when Yosef comes in from the field, and the whole story of Cain and Hevel takes place on the field, and they see him coming, they may very likely see him as a Cain figure, and therefore they see him as somebody who is so dangerous. And there's an economic difference between the two. The farmer needs property, while the shepherd sort of doesn't care about boundaries and goes from place to place to place to place. So therefore, it's also on an economic level, and that's clearly the background of the Cain Hevel story, between the difference between the two of them. While Yosef is dreaming, therefore, about land, and the brothers are dreaming or acting within this other realm, so there is going to be a disconnect there. Now, that's the first part of it. The second part of it is the brother and the brother's keeper, which again, I'm going to say is there. I've written about this in multiple places, including 2 chapters in a book which I haven't released yet. And that has to do mostly, it's a book about Tisha B'Av. And in terms of really where you're going with this, in terms of destruction and so on, and sinat chinam, because this is it. This is really where we begin with the real sinat chinam. But you made an assumption along the way, or a declaration along the way, which is not necessarily one which I agree with, and that is culpability. And therefore, that's because something happens to Yosef, therefore you say, well, he must have deserved this. And I'm not willing to agree with that whatsoever. I think that there are other things going on. So I'm just saying that whole premise I want to push aside. On top of all that, there's another issue, which is, as far as I can tell, the actual subtext of what's taking place. So even though I agree with you that the Cain Hevel story is there as a theme, but it's not the subtext. The subtext, or the introduction, of Vayeishev is really something which happened before. And if you don't see it, then it's almost like you can't understand what's going on. So I'm just saying it's not the Cain and Hevel story is not the dominant issue. It's there. It's on a back burner. It's beneath the surface. It's a subconscious, but there is something which is there in their consciousness, which we have to deal with. Otherwise, we just don't understand the words we're reading. But of course, I didn't reveal what it is yet.
It's interesting because I think you made an assumption that when I said culpability, I was throwing all the responsibility on Yosef, maybe for telling the dreams or whatever. But I actually see it. Okay, so if you're going to look at the immediate story, right? You see what? You see the first thing you see is that Yosef's telling the dreams to his brothers who already hate him, right?
No, that's not the first thing. There were things before that.
No, I'm saying in Vayeishev. Okay, right, that's true. You see that the father loves Yosef because he's Ben Zukunin, the son of his old age, and therefore he gives him the coat of many colors. And right. I mean, the stripe, I don't think it says, I don't know why people say coat of many colors, because it says Ketonet Pasim. Maybe it's in the Makar, right. But it just means like a striped overcoat, right?
Right.
But so it says that the brothers saw that their father loved him more than the rest of them, and that they hated him. And then he tells them the dream, right? And then he tells them the dreams, and then they continue to hate him more. And then he tells them the other dream, and then they start to be jealous once it's the dream with the sun, the moon, and the stars. But okay, yes, I definitely see it going all the way back. But it's interesting because you say that it's the main connection is not the Cain Hevel connection, but yet it's the Cain and Hevel is the brother hating and being jealous. And then the way that I understand it is when that's not fixed, it keeps perpetuating and getting worse. And then in each scenario that we see that comes to us in the Torah portions before is maybe an opportunity for brother and brother to work it out. Maybe let's, if we want to go to Yaakov and Esav, that perhaps they could have been that brother force with working together and brotherly love and watching out for each other. And once that didn't happen, for I guess there's a few reasons why that didn't happen, then and Yaakov took the blessing from Esav. Now Yaakov finds himself 4 wives later with 12 sons, and the problem is still there. The problem hasn't been fixed, and it goes on. Like they said, the sins of the fathers becomes that of the children, and now it becomes it's on Yosef and the brothers, the same exact thing that perhaps if it was fixed with Yaakov and Esav wouldn't have to go. There is that opinion, right? That someone says that when I think it stems from here when it says that Yaakov wanted to Vayeishev Yaakov to sit b'sheket b'shalva, that he was really, maybe I heard it from you, that he was the one who was supposed to go down to Mitzrayim, but he didn't want that, and then it ended up becoming Yosef's responsibility to become the leader there and to set things straight there. And so I don't understand how we can take it somewhere a step removed from the whole Cain and Hevel fiasco, because I feel like it's still trying to right that wrong, and every time we don't right that wrong, we get deeper and deeper into exile. So what is it that you're referring to that is the real deeper issue that's not connected to Cain and Hevel? Because I don't understand it. I'm not seeing it.
Right. Okay. So open up your Chumash. So we'll skip that first pasuk, and we'll start with pasuk bet. Eila toldot Yaakov. So before you read any further, one thing that I was taught, in terms of how to learn, is that you always ask yourself, so what should it say next? I mean, most of us, when we learn, we try to understand what it said, but you don't understand what it said until you understand what it could have or should have said. So we get to Eila Toldot Yaakov, so what should be the continuation of the verse? And it's clear once you read it that it is awkward, but even before you get to that awkwardness, it's very simple, and that's to go back to Perek Lamed Vav Pasuk Aleph, and that is Ela Toldot Esav, who Edom. So now once you see Ela Toldot Esav, who Edom, now you realize that this should have said Ela Toldot Yaakov, who Yisrael. That should have been the continuation of the pasuk. And then Esav Bakachet Nashav Mibnot Canaan, and so on. And then it should have said Yaakov Bakach Nashim, and or so on. And then it should have told about all of the wives. And then you have the whole list of the kids, because Ela Toldot Yaakov. But instead, it tells us something very different. It's Ela Toldot Yaakov Yosef. So that is a little strange because it's focusing on Yosef. So we're missing something still, because again, it's not going the direction it should have. So what are we missing? So I think the most important pasuk, I don't want to oversell this or overstate this, but I think the most important pasuk to understand the rest of Bereshit is in this same section with Esav. And of course, the problem is we don't like to read these things because it's boring. It's like a laundry list. So therefore, we sort of don't pay any attention to it. Although I can assure you that within these kinds of sections, there is incredible depth, even though you have to work a little bit harder. But the answer, the reveal, is in Pasuk Lamed Aleph, which is another pasuk written in an awkward way. Ve'ela hamalachim, and here are the kings, asher malchu be'eretz Edom, who ruled in Edom, lifnei malach melech levnei Yisrael. What an interesting pasuk. Why is it even talking about, Yisrael? Yisrael's not going to have a king for the longest possible time. And by the way, notice over here, it's not Bnei Yaakov or by Yaakov, it's Yisrael, which means the issue over here is going to be who is going to be king. That's the question all the way through from now to the end. Who is going to be king? And the answer, the initial answer, or the first candidate that we're getting, whom, by the way, may not be the first candidate, but the first candidate that we're learning about right now in Vayeishev is Yosef. Ela Toldot Yaakov, Yosef. Now, what was I don't want to say disagreeing with, but what I felt was not nuanced enough was that you were primarily reading it, and almost everything you said in your preamble, you were reading it as a family issue, and within one family, brothers not getting along, and the issue is not a family, the issue is not brothers, the issue is a nation. Because what happens when a nation needs a leader, which means it's not just that Yaakov is going to say who's going to get the double portion, and it's not just a monetary issue in a family, it's a thing about a king. And if you realize this, it starts to go back much, much earlier. Probably the time that the kids, Reuben, Shimon, Levi, have an awakening about this is the day that their father wakes them up, and I'll just embellish, in the middle of the night and says, "We're leaving. Where are we going? We're going to the promised land." Right? How many Jews in history, would have been very excited about their parents waking them up and say, "We're going now." But what about them? This is the only life they've ever known is living with their grandfather, with Saba Lavan, right? The Zaidi Lavan. I mean, it's just a very funny thing. And Yaakov has to explain to them along the way that no, even though this is the only life you've ever known, this is not our life. This is not our destiny. This is not who we are. We are, and again, I don't think he has the language yet. I'm Yisrael. We are something else. No. Now, when I say that this is the issue, I'm just going to point out at a couple of places that it already emerges. One is in the Dinah story. And of course, in the Dinah story, there's so much other things over there. But I want to look at it in two places. One, in Pasuk Bet. Vayar ota Shechem ben Chamor hachivi nisi haaretz, right? Lamed Daled Bet. Vayar ota Shechem ben Chamor hachivi nisi haaretz. Now that's really interesting because it is a royal family, right? And who is she? Dinah bat Yaakov, and you know what's missing there? Nisi haaretz, because who's really the Nisi haaretz? Whose land is this really? So I'm just saying is that, again, lack of parallelism is something which bothers us, especially when we know whose side we're on. Now look what happens next. When Yaakov hears about it, it says in Pasuk Hey, but Yaakov shama ki time et Dinah bito. Yaakov heard that something terrible happened to his daughter. Very personal, very human. And look what happens when the brothers come in Pasuk Zayin. Uvnei Yaakov ba'u min hasadeh kishamam v'yitz'atzvu anashim v'yicher lema'od. Why? Ki nivala asa b'Yisrael. They see it on a national level. They see it as an outrage. It's not just that this happened to their sister. It doesn't say their sister. right? It's gonna, again, there is that brother-sister relationship, but that's not the issue for them. The issue is that this is a slight be Yisrael. It's a slight to Yaakov Avinu. It's a slight to somebody who is king, which means the reason there's a disconnect between Yaakov and his sons is because Yaakov sees it as a family issue, as a family matter, which means actually Yaakov is reading this the way that you are, while the sons are reading it very, very different. So I'm just pointing out that this question of who will be king, by the time we get to Parshat Vayeishev, it's very, very clear, and it's on people's minds, and it is the issue. Who is the one who's going to take over? So let's continue now in Lamed Zayin. Eila toldot Yaakov, Yosef ben 17 shana, which means what is the toldot of Yaakov? So instead of saying Yaakov's Yisrael, instead of all the other people, it goes straight to Yosef. So now you know Yosef is the candidate. Hu ro'eh, now that is so interesting because he is not a shepherd, but rather hu ro'eh et achav batzon. He oversees, he shepherds his brothers who are the ones who are shepherding, which means he is placed on top of them, which is something we're going to hear later on. And the commentaries have a hard time with Na'ar. So I'm going to say he kids around, but we're missing the main issue. The main issue over here is actually something else. The description of Bnei Bilhah and Bnei Zilpah is Nishei Aviv, the wives of his father. Go back again to what Reuven did, right? The action of Reuven, which is in Perek Lamed Hey. The end of Perek Lamed Hey Pasuk Kaf Bet. And this now will reveal to you what's really going on. V'yihi b'shton Yisrael be'eretz ahi, v'yelech Reuven v'yishka Bilhah pilegesh aviv, v'yishma Yisrael. By the way, notice, it goes on to Yisrael. And v'yihu b'nei Yaakov shnei masar. And that's pasuk b'toch pasuk. So that itself is fascinating, the going from Yisrael, back to Yaakov, which means Yaakov will not allow what Reuven just now did to break up the family. That by the way, is amazing. No, b'nei Yaakov shnei masar, v'yishma Yisrael. But by Yishma Yisrael means that's a national response, but then Bnei Yaakov were 12. So why is the national versus the individual? What's going on over here? But we skipped over the main part. The main part is Bilhah Pilegesh Aviv, which means Reuven's orientation towards Bilhah is that she's a Pilegesh. On the other hand, Yosef's orientation towards Bnei Bilhah and Bnei Zilpah is Nishei Aviv. Yosef sees them as being brothers. By the way, Achi ani b'vakesh, Yosef was trying to create brotherhood. He sees them as being equals and being brothers, which, by the way, that's the problem because there is inequality over here. But one more second, and I'll lay out the whole thought as a whole, and then you can respond. Reuven, it's a gambit. What's his gambit? It's like we learn later on by Adoniyahu, is that he wants to take the Pilegish of David in order to claim himself to be leader. Reuven's doing that right here. Reuven is making a play for the kingship. And if you're going to ask me again, but hold it, that's before the pasuk with Esav. No, but it's already after the brothers are thinking in this way. And Yaakov, maybe they feel, does not act enough in terms of pride. They could be upset. Reuven could be upset that he bows down to Esav. It could be upset the way that he wants to deal with the Dinah issue, because they see themselves as a nation. And Reuven is ready to stand up now and take responsibility and declare himself king, take Bilhah. And as I said, there's a lot of there are a lot of assumptions over there about himself and who he is and who he could be and who he should be. And Yaakov just shuts it down completely. But Yaakov won't let the family break up. And by the way, that's an amazing, juggling act that Yaakov does over there to be able to, smack Reuven down, but on the other hand, keep the family together. That's not a simple thing. How do you recover from a thing like that? And I'm reading it, of course, without Chazal's cover up, as it were. But just now, let's now think about the politics. Reuven, as far as he's concerned, is the older brother, and there are only really two candidates to lead, him and Yosef. And he has underneath him Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, Yisachar, Zebulun, and all of Bill and Zilpah's kids, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. These kids are not, they're not players in all this. They are B'nai HaShvachot. They are B'nai HaPilagshim. And now look what Yosef does. Yosef stands up and says, "Hunar b'nei Bilhah b'nei Zilpah." He hangs with them and he kids with them, but he'll report to their father. Again, this role that Yaakov is going to have of keep the family together, and you have to discipline when someone deserves discipline, is exactly the follow-up of that story. And Yosef now is the extension of his father, and he understands his father. He understands is what we need to do. Which means the duality of the relationship here is, on the one hand, Yosef sees them as brothers, and therefore Yosef sees that when they do something which is not the way it should be, that their father has to get involved in order for the family to be together. But the idea of the family being together, Yosef takes it further than Reuven can take it, and he sees all of them as being brothers. Now, there is collateral damage to that, which means Reuven was trying to make an argument. I am the oldest son. I'm the oldest son of the first wife, and therefore I get precedence. And Yaakov just pushes that away. No, Yosef, but there was one more thing that you said, that Yaakov loved Yosef, and the truth is it never says that. I know you think it says that, but everyone thinks it says that. But it actually says something a little different. V'Yisrael ahav et Yosef, which means we just went back and forth, and that's what you have to keep on paying attention to over here, the national versus the individual. Yosef, Yisrael loves Yosef, he ben zakunim lo, which of course the Targum points out, who's a ben chakim, he's smart, he's talented, which means it's not that Yaakov loves him because he's Yosef or Rachel's son, it's that Yisrael loves him. By the way, the brothers don't get it. The brothers, when they look at it, they say, oh, he's the favorite, but which means their own jealousy doesn't allow them to see Yosef's capability, which is actually what's going to be taking place now to the end. But I just want to explain one more thing about the dynamics over here, or maybe two things. One is, Yosef treats everyone as equals, but of course he's not equal to them because he's on top of all of them. So the way that the B'nai Leah would have seen the world is they would like to be primary, but they're going to end up secondary. So you're going to have B'nai Rachel, and then underneath it, B'nai Leah, and then underneath it, you're going to have the Shvachot. So they're on top of them. So they are very close to the most important. But what does Yosef do? He says, no, you're all my brothers, but you're all my brothers, so he's trying to look for equality and treat them better. But on the other hand, who loses from that? Who loses from the equality? The B'nai Leah lose, which means Yosef's love and equality for the B'nai Bilhah and B'nai Zilpah, who he sees as Neshei Aviv, is actually the thing which is again into trouble. What is the unbelievable irony in all this? The irony is that eventually Yosef succeeds in bringing all the brothers together. How so? When the attempted murder and then the sale of Yosef takes place, the B'nai Bilhah and B'nai Zilpah are there. So they actually have to make a moral choice. Do we defend Yosef and stand up against the B'nai Leah? Do we defend Yosef and the one who's been our protector and the one who's looked after us and treats us as equals? Or we have an unbelievable opportunity now. Now the B'nai Leah will accept us because we're co-conspirators, which means once the sale is over, again, attempted murder, sale is over, they're in it together with them. So what is their choice? So they don't make the moral choice, they make the pragmatic choice, and they join the B'nai Leah and B'nai Zilpah. And from this point on, there are going to be, all those brothers are together now because they're all partners in crime. So Yosef succeeds in uniting the family by virtue of being the victim of all of them and being sold. And part of what he was trying to do was to unite the family. So now I'm going to go back and say it again. I think that the Cain and Hevel story is a subtext of this, but it's not the issue. And a matter of fact, when Yosef has his first dream, it becomes very, very clear. First of all, Yaakov gives him the Knot Pasim, which is royal clothing. As we see later on in the Navi, we see that, Tamar is wearing the same things. The children of the king are wearing this. He's giving him a robe. He's giving him clothing of royalty. The next is he has the dream. And what is their response to the dream? Immediately, their response is, Vayomru lo, pasuk tet, Hamloch timloch aleinu? Are you really going to be king? Which means this question of being king is the issue in people's heads. That's not just a random response. It's not a random response after Reuven has been shut down and Yosef has been chosen and he's been given the clothing of many colors and he's put on top of everybody else and he's acting as the prince. That's really as he's behaving. And the brothers are saying, are you going to be king? Which means we're not willing to accept you. And this is really the B'nai Leah are the ones who are there, who are the ones who are primarily not accepting him because, again, they're the ones who are going to feel most disenfranchised by his being chosen. It's going to go back to the Rachel over Leah and so on. There's a lot of layers of the jealousy over here. But I'm just going to say it again now. From this point to the end of the book, the question becomes who is going to be king, And that's going to be really the fight between Yosef and Yehuda, the tension between Yosef and Yehuda. And then we have a surprise ending. The surprise ending is that Yaakov chooses Yehuda subsequently. And he says, no, Yehuda is the one who's going to be king. So over here, the candidate is Yosef. And Yehuda does not look like a candidate, which means he shows leadership qualities, but it's a really surprise ending to the book where Yehuda ends up winning, which, by the way, theologically is amazing, because it's saying that I have a tzaddik more. Just look at the two sections. Look at Yehuda and Tamar, where he sleeps with his daughter-in-law, but his defense is that he thought she was only a prostitute. I mean, that is not the best defense that one can possibly have. And then you compare that right afterwards with Yosef and Eshet Potiphar, where Yosef stands up and says, no, this would be a sin. Nobody's there. Nobody's watching. He has no idea that we'll be reading this, thousands of years later, and are going to realize what Yosef did, that he walked out of the room. And you can have every reason in the world to say why he should have sinned, but he doesn't sin, which means you really have this competition between the tzaddik gamor and the Baal Tshuva. So it's interesting that Judaism, and by the way, Christianity never understood this, is that Judaism chooses as Mashiach, chooses as the one who's going to bring people back, is David, who's the same thing as Yehuda. It's somebody who's impetuous, sometimes somebody who makes mistakes, but is able to be strong enough to stand up and say, Chatati LaHashem, which means that from here on in, the story is who will be king. That is the story. A subtext, one of the subtexts, are all the brother fights that took place in the whole book, which obviously takes us back to the very first one. But I'm saying this is not just my imagination. It's the comparison which the Torah gave the introduction to it. Here are the kings in Edom before there was a king in Israel. And now, the rest of the book, let's talk about who's going to be the king in Israel. And therefore, the brothers are responding, and it's really there, which means Yosef does become the Moshel. They do bow down to him. But the difference between a melech and a moshel is a melech is somebody who's beloved, who's coronated and accepted, and the moshel is a dictator. Yosef is the dictator. Yosef is the one who really doesn't care ultimately about their response. He rules over them, and that's how he sees his job. But at the end of the day, it's Yehuda who wins, and that, as far as I can tell, is really what's going on over here. The one other thing that I'll say is that there is one other subtext to all of this, and that is the beginning of the Egyptian exile, which means the other thing which is taking place is that it's God's will that they are going to end up in Egypt one way or the other, which means Yosef can go north, but God wants him to go south. He's going to end up going south. And the brothers can think they're selling him as a slave, and they're going to end up as slaves, which means this is all there to fulfill the Brit Bein of Tarim. And that's what I responded before to you in terms of, as it being perceived as a punishment or something. No, this is the Brit Bein of Tarim, which needs to be played out. They need to go down to Egypt now, and they're going to have to get out of Egypt, eventually. But this is going to be the end of the story over here, which means, we're finishing up all the strands that have been thrown into us in the whole book. Yes, it's the Cain and Hevel, it's the Avram story, it's the Brit Bein of Tarim, and all this is going to come together now and get clarity. So I would say the last third of the book, Yosef is the hero. Yehuda is the surprise hero at the end. Yehuda ends up having real change in character, which I think happens in a subtle way to other people along the way, but with him it's dramatic, the change that takes place. And that itself is an incredible message. So yes, Cain and Hevel are there. Yes, the Brit Bein of Turim are there. The issue of kingship is really the issues at the forefront. And then you have all the family dynamic along the way, which makes the whole story obviously much more compelling.
Okay, so that all makes total sense to me. But what I want to ask is, you say, it's about kingship, and that Yehuda ends up being the one who finally is coronated, or so to speak. At least he's appointed by Yaakov to be, the source of the kings. But why did he merit that in the end, right? Why did he merit that in the end? Is it because, I don't know that it's because of this thing with Tamar, or is it because that he did the arevut with Binyamin, which probably really spoke to Yaakov? And then that's kind of a repair of the whole Cain and Hevel thing, which might have merited him to be the kingship. So they're so linked, those two topics, that I don't even know if it could be separated to say that it's about the kingship and not about the brotherhood and the arevut, because that's maybe what merited him to attain that position, because a king, what does a king have to do? A king is the one who has to unify the people. A king is the one who has to show that quality. So maybe it does stem all back to that. I don't know that I can see the separation in topics,
but as I said, it's that Yehuda is able to become this person who can stand up for Binyamin because of what happened previously, both Yosef and because of the Mechirat Yosef, and because of the whole story with Tamar. Look, the other one, I'll say one more thing, and then I'll leave you to ask or comment or say that by the time we get to the future, in terms of the time of the Navi, you have the Malchut Beit David, but very quickly you have a Malchut Yosef or Yisrael, where the brothers all join Yosef and all leave Yehuda, which means you get to Navi and there's this unpredictable flip that had taken place over there. And then you have the Haftorah, which at least should be read on Parshat Vayeishev, is the Haftorah about the two trees, which are going to merge together, which means ultimately it's not just Yehuda standing up for Binyamin. Ultimately, Yehuda has to stand up for Yosef. Ultimately, Yosef has to prepare the way for Yehuda. Ultimately, the two of them need to come together and merge together, which means the ultimate merger of brothers is Yosef and Yehuda, which means it's easier to stand up for Binyamin, who's young and vulnerable and so on and so forth, but to stand up for Yosef was a little bit more, because Yosef is so much more capable, and therefore to stand up for him, they're the egos on the line much more. But ultimately, in Judaism, it's Mashiach ben Yosef and Mashiach ben David coming together and working together. But I'm saying all of that is really the subtext of what's taking place over here, and that's why these parshot are just so dramatic.
Yeah, I'm very happy because you just segued into my next comment, which was going to be based on what you said with the Malchut of Yosef and the Malchut of Yehuda. And it seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, but so Yosef is the one who is able to, at least from the Torah's perspective, is the one who's able to interact with the other nations. He's able to go to Egypt, and he's able to rule in the country with other nations that are not Israel. And Yehuda seems to have merited the leadership to be the kingship of Israel. And then I always see it as this Malchut of Yosef. Yosef is the one who's more interactive with the other nations and is able to successfully do that, and that he has to be a tzaddik gamor in his person to be able to stand up and deal with the other nations. And that in terms of being malchut for us, when we're building our character and building our nation, we need that the person that's more relatable to us as someone who can fall and rise, someone who can model, how to achieve perfection on a personal level as well. And then at the end of the days, it's all going to hopefully meld together, because we're trying to get at the point where dealing with the nations, when they're finally going to understand God and that his Malchut and his kingdom is one, and they'll have an understanding basically of what we're supposed to already understand now, and that the coming together of the Yosef and the Yehuda will be because the picture is complete. That something like that can't happen till the end of days, because we're at odds with the other nations now. So it's not even possible that I don't think that the Malchut of Yosef and the Malchut of Yehuda could come together. If it could, I think that would mean the end of days, where we have it all, the whole picture complete. Is that correct, or am I seeing that wrong?
There are certain parts where it's more obvious what you're saying, and certain parts where it may not be exactly the same thing, which means how much should we look at the Yosef in Egypt as the real prototype of Mashiach ben Yosef, which means how identical they are, which part of it is the same, which means part of who Yosef is in Egypt is tzafnat paneach. He's hidden. No one really knows who he is. His righteousness is hidden. His greatness is to a certain extent hidden. His identity is hidden. So how much of that is going to be a part of Mashiach ben Yosef as well, in terms of the hiddenness of it? So or being, a little bit underneath the surface and not even realizing that it's there. So the place to read a lot about this is in the Vilna Gaon students, when they wrote this book called the Kol HaTorah. The Kol HaTorah is their tradition of the messianic teachings of the Vilna Gaon, which he gave, and part of the thesis there is whoever comes to Israel to help build up Israel, to build up Jerusalem specifically, is a part of, as a spark of Mashiach ben Yosef in their souls. And part of the reason for this is based on a Midrash Tanchuma, which says that Yosef and Zion are the same. They both suffer from jealousy. And I just have to pause for a second, because sometimes you hear the words and you don't get what they're saying. Yosef and Zion are both of the same gematria. It's 156. And Kin'ah, jealousy, is also 156. So the Midrash is saying that Yosef and Zion are the same. They're both beautiful, and both, the people want them, but people hate them. And there's this like whole complexity. So the Gra, to a great extent, uses that Midrash Tanchuma as his explanation of what is taking place. So therefore, because there is a connection between Zion and Zion and Yosef, the Gra saw anybody who helps build it, and therefore he felt a lot of this could be undercover. And therefore, one of the things that Rav Kook got attacked for the most was when he spoke about even Herzl of having a spark of Mashiach ben Yosef in him. He said Herzl's not even religious and into marrying kids and whatever. But that's exactly the point of Yosef. It's hidden. But all that Rav Kook did is he took the teaching from the Gra and he applied it to Herzl. You could debate whether this was right or wrong, good or bad, but it's not surprising. It's not surprising at all, because to the extent, if you would have looked at Yosef in Egypt, and we're the brothers, when we come down, we take a look and saying, oh yeah, by the way, that's the guy who's going to be the Mashiach. You can say, what are you talking about? That's the guy who's threatening Jewish survival. It's like the exact opposite of what you would think. No, it's all very undercover. So therefore, when you get to the later level, and there's also another issue, is that, and this is, from the Arizal onward, a lot of the Kabbalists talk about it. I know that your Sephardic heritage, perhaps you're familiar with this, is that Ubichisei David Avdacha, in some of the Sephardi sidders, there's a kavanah, which is written underneath the words. And it says there, the kavanah, Ubichisei David Avdacha, the throne of David, it says that you should then pray and have kavanah that Mashiach ben Yosef doesn't die. Why? Because there's a Gemara that says Mashiach ben Yosef is going to die. So what's the Arizal talking about? Well, how can you pray he's not going to die if the Gemara says he's going to die? So actually, the Gemara doesn't say he's going to die. It says that there's going to be a great crying and a eulogy for him, because everyone will think that he died. So just like Yosef, how many years of Yosef's life did his family think he was dead? So therefore, there's this other element of Mashiach ben Yosef that you're going to think that he's dead. And by the way, you can imagine certain groups then using this Mashiach ben Yosef teaching for Mashiach ben David and say, oh, you think that he's dead, but he's really not dead. He's really going to come back. And you can imagine how that could possibly be twisted around. And I'll leave it at that.
Right. Wow. Yeah, that's a lot. I think that I'm going to let that settle in, because I mean, you've answered any of my questions there. And there's something that I'm hoping to have the time, because I also have another question, which I'm hoping you can tell me why I'm wrong. Otherwise, I can't get out of this train of thought. And it all stems from Yaakov and everything that all the tragedies that seem to come one after another when he gets back. And for me, I really see this repetition of the words Shalom and Vayeishev, right? And it takes me back to Vayeishev, when he first has the dream and he makes a neder to God, and he says, if you will, watch me on the way, give me clothes to wear, food to eat, and protect me that I can come back. And he says, return, Lashev, and he uses the word shalem, to return whole to his father's house. Then he makes the neder, he'll give a tenth of everything. And God seems to keep that promise very, very well. The first time we ever see a problem, so all the 20 years he's with Lavan, God really helps him out through all the sticky situations that could have gone a different way, and he comes out unscathed with a lot of abundant, family and possessions and everything. So when do we first see the problem? God even watches out for him when he's meeting Esav, which is extremely, extremely dangerous and hazardous. If anything can go wrong, I think that's really where it could have happened. But yet he hasn't really returned yet, right? now after Esav, we're told that he steps foot, Esav goes, they part ways, Seir, and Yaakov comes to Sukkot. And what does it say there? It says he comes to Sukkot and he builds himself a bayit. Now, automatically, I'm thinking, I know that this is a little bit ambiguous how it says it, where he had the dream with the ladder, that he says, if all this will be a bayit for you, and I will give a tenth of everything. So you can say, the fact is, he doesn't say that I will build you a bayit. I'm okay with that if you want to say the Beit HaMikdash will eventually be there. But I still see a lot of hints why I think that it's problematic. And he comes back and he has peace. We never see him give a tenth of everything. And then you see him start to lose what appears to me to be some sort of equivalent to a tenth. As soon as he builds the bayit in Sukkot and he comes back, and what does it say? It says he comes to the Ir Shechem, and you hear the words over and over again when Chamor says they come to us shalem, and he bought land from them and he built himself a house, and it says he comes to settle with us whole. And I'm thinking, like, there's a reason why there's repeating these words about returning and shalem with shalom, and that God even tells him after this fiasco that happens when Dinah gets raped by Shechem. He reminds him, he says, go back to that place, go back to Beit El, where you made me a promise. And I think God's hinting to him that he hasn't done everything that he's supposed to do. And he tells him in that pasuk he says he should, it says Lashev, I don't remember exactly the word, he uses the same thing. He should like encamp there and build a Mizbeach, but he doesn't. He just builds a Mizbeach and he moves on. And then we see more tragedy happen. And then you see he builds something else, and then somebody else dies, and then we see again here before it happens with the language seems to be consistent with go see the shalom of your brothers, and I feel like there's all these hints. And when it says in our Parshat Vayeishev, I see it also as it could be the different nikud. It's the same exact word as he returned. He returned to the place of his father. He returned whole. It doesn't seem like he fulfilled, at least in the text, it doesn't tell us that he fulfilled his promise to God. And in my head, I can't help but think, it's not that I think that, I know that people don't like to say, this is a punishment for this, and such dramatic things like a rape of the daughter and the sun going down and all these things, but to say you're going to devote your life a certain way to God and not to, at least in the text, I don't see the fulfillment of it. I think that's extremely problematic. And the fact that the words in every time that there's a tragedy seem to point back to that promise that he didn't appear to keep, I can't help but see it to be the repercussion of these events. Do you see what I'm saying? Because
no, absolutely. So I'll just disappoint you a little bit by not telling you you're wrong. I think that you're right, and I also see that you didn't hear my shir last week because I touched on a whole bunch of these issues. A whole bunch of these issues, and I agree with you completely in terms of the read of it. That God has to constantly remind him, and he goes through all kinds of suffering along the way. I think all the things you pointed out are correct. I think there's more issues involved as well. I think that he takes the Eved and turns it into a matzeva. Later on, he's going to build another matzeva and that Rachel and so on. There are other things along the way that you do have to question. Did he fulfill this? I also think that the Midrashic teaching that the Briach Hatichon, that large piece of wood that ran through the Mishkan, that Yaakov said, where'd they get it from? Oh, Yaakov brought it down to Egypt with him, and that was part of the Mishkan. I thought that was a Midrashic attempt for Yaakov finally to keep his word. Is that when they build the Mishkan, he donated the centerpiece of it, so therefore he can have his hand in the building of the Beit Lashem. I thought that was some kind of, I don't want to say poetic justice, but a poetic way of telling us that Yaakov somehow does keep his word. To defend Yaakov a little bit, but you can counter it. To defend him a little bit, the way that he made the vow is when I get back to my father's house.
Right, I thought.
And a lot of the things happen along the way. But the counter is exactly what you pointed out: is that he ends up spending probably around 18 months or so in Israel before he gets back over there. So therefore, why exactly is he there? Which means, why does he build the house over there? Why is he coming so slowly? Why doesn't, once he gets past the Esav thing, doesn't he make the trip much, quicker? So that would seem to be the question, all this, and that seems to be where God also is registering his protest, as it were. Yes, we don't like to say that the Avot did something wrong, but over here, when God keeps on calling him on it, so then the question becomes a little bit stronger. The one thing that I would take issue with, not that I disagree, but rather it just doesn't say it. To say that Dinah was raped, it doesn't actually say that.
Right.
It could be. It says she's abused. It could be. It's very unclear. And part of what I think is valuable is to compare the Dinah story with the Tamar Amnon story, which has a lot of similar elements to it. But there it says rape, and then once he does what he does, he hates her. And over here, whatever happens, then he loves her. So how much does that make sense in terms of the larger narrative over here? I think it's complex. I think it's worthwhile studying. I think it's worthwhile considering a lot of different situations. When I've taught it, and I stopped teaching it, by the way, because I just think it's too much. It's too heavy, and there's so much other things to teach there. But when I would teach it, I would present it at least as a possibility of being what it's called sometimes a date rape, that they are friendly, but then things escalate a little bit more than she wanted it to escalate. So therefore, as far as he's concerned, everything's okay. But as far as she's concerned, then it's not everything okay. But then does she still keep him as a boyfriend or not? I'm not even making reference to that book that I never read, but I'm the red tent, but what I am making, whatever, there was a book, but I'm making reference over here to what I think are possible readings of it. And sometimes the importance of education is actually to read something in multiple ways and saying, okay, how does this make sense, or that makes sense, or this makes sense? And I think it is complex.
Yes, I saw it that way also. I was afraid to say it because of the way that it's so accepted, but the fact that it says Vayikach, so I always think this Vayikach could be with words like we've been told, Vayikach, Vayishka, Vayaneha. So until the Vayaneha part, you can't be so sure that, I'm not that she wasn't manipulated and all that stuff, but how it went down exactly, I also have a huge question mark in my head. Just that I know that it was not okay, for several other reasons. But if it was a direct, taking her and raping her, I don't see it from the narrative being that way either. Not that, of course, I'm saying that any of it was okay, but I'm just saying in terms of the word or the way you would think about rape, I don't see it that way either. But I do want to just make this connection. Then again, when we're talking about, I really feel that Dinah, how Dinah and Yosef, they say, we're switched in utero, whatever, that there are very much similarities between the two in terms of how Yosef is portrayed and the potential that we're told about Dinah, about going out and being, that she might have been able to have a tremendous influence on Esav and turn things around. It seems to be the same thing as how Yosef was able to have a positive effect in Mitzrayim. And I think that the fact is very interesting to me that, and I do like very much the Midrash that in the end he ends up marrying Asnat.
Right.
And they have Ephraim and Menashe, and that makes a lot of sense to me. How come that
the two rejected children coming together is very interesting. I also wrote about this someplace. Don't even ask me where. I don't remember anymore. That's the downside of having 12 books.
Right. And the reason, a part of why I really like that so much, when you say the rejected children, the children that suffer, I think that's really a great lesson, and not just something that people want to hear, but something that's so true and that so resonates with me, is that suffering, extreme suffering, and suffering that you might not ever see a way out of, like what Dinah had to endure and what Yosef had to go through, and somebody in that point in time would never possibly be able to see what was in their future, what was meant for them to come after that. But to see that extreme suffering, no matter how painful it is, it can be for a purpose, and that it should be encouragement for people to hang in there I really that resonates with me very well. But one more thing that I wanted to just discuss really quickly before we go, if that's okay with you, is I found it very interesting, this encounter that Yosef has with the Ish on his way when he's searching for his brothers. I like the parallels between the fact that he has an encounter with an Ish and Yaakov has an encounter with an Ish. And there's so many similarities because Yaakov is about to go meet up with his brother who wants to kill him. Yosef, although he doesn't know and they might not yet have conspired to kill him, he's about to meet up with his brothers who want to kill him. And this is like a moment where both of them were also sent from their parents. Yaakov was sent from Rivka and Yitzchak, leave, go, and he has this time in between of where he can meditate and think, and he has to sort of contend with certain things. And also Yosef, he's sent from his father, a long journey where he has a lot to think about before he goes to check on his brothers. And I think that these moments are like meditative moments where they're meant to come to some sort of epiphany or some sort of growth. All this alone time and suffering from something is a growth moment. And I find that the encounters are very, very important. I don't know how, people interpret the Ish, if they want to say it's a malach or somebody who is sent by God. I don't really see why it matters. I think that when something happens, I see an angel as any force or anything that happens in order to be able to turn you in a certain direction to come to a certain conclusion or a growth. And so I really see it as that. But I don't know, is there a thought that there was no actual physical being, and that he was having his own sort of discussion with himself, sort of?
By Yaakov?
Yeah, no, not by Yaakov. By Yaakov I know, but by Yosef, I've always heard it being a discussion whether it's an angel or a man or what the story is, but nothing further than that. Like, how do you see that?
I think there's a larger question, and that is, why is the Torah telling us this? And that's the bigger question.
Okay.
Which means, when you're writing a story about somebody, you travel from here, you go to there, you say, oh, and he stopped along the side of the road and, asked somebody for directions, and meaning, why is that, really relevant? And if it made it into the Torah, so then it has to be a reason. And the issue would seem to be that God wanted, that's why I go back to the Brit Ben Abtarim. God, and that's what Rashi refers to, that he sent to Me'emek Chevron, from something very deep in Chevron, which is Avraham, which is the Brit Ben B'Tarim, which means there's a covenant here, which has to take place. And therefore, even if you wander in the wrong direction and you get lost, because just think, the story could have ended very differently. Yaakov tells Yosef to go, check on your brothers, see what's going on, and come back and give me a report. Yosef goes to Shem. They're not there. He comes back to Dad. I went. They're not there. Sorry, I don't know where they are. Okay, story over. No Mechirat Yosef, no slavery in Egypt. But that can't be. That can't happen that way. The way the story has to happen is we end up in Egypt, and that's Me'emek Chevron. That's the Brit Ben B'Tarim, and therefore the Torah sticks in this an angel, as it were. An angel is an emissary of God to make sure that God's will takes place. So therefore, it doesn't make a difference if it's a person or an angel. It is somebody here to facilitate God's will have to take place in this particular way. So, sometimes we are angels. Sometimes we do a task in this world and we don't realize what we're doing at the time, and we don't realize that we are being facilitators for God. I'll tell you a story, true story. There was somebody who had very, very serious financial issues, so I wanted to make sure would get a job, and I try to, get someone in the perfect stucker, right? Somebody who was a widow and lots of kids and whatever, and I try to, work out that they can get a job, and I tried to get somebody who would guarantee $10,000 towards this. And they said, I'm not really sure. And they said, and their whole thing was based upon the amount of students who would come and would they have the money to pay and whatever. And I finally said to him, commit. And if you have a problem afterwards, I'll help you raise the money. Just commit now. It'll happen. It won't happen. Commit. The woman will get the job. We'll take care of her. And afterwards, we'll figure it out. Either it's going to work out by itself or afterwards I'll help you. I hung up the phone. The next second, my phone rang. And there was somebody who was asking me if I can do them a favor or something else. And they said, on top of everything else, if you do this, there is a $10,000 gift of charity, which will come along with this. I'm not saying that this is not like a 10,000. It was right there. I'm saying it was within 10 seconds of one another. So it was very, very clear to me. I had made this decision that this woman needs to be helped. So who am I? I mean, essentially, HaKadosh Baruch Hu made a decision. So once I decided that I'm going to be the malach in this and I'm going to make sure that this happens, HaKadosh Baruch Hu works behind the scenes and makes it happen. And it was just so clear to me that it was, sometimes we become the malachim. Sometimes we become those that facilitate what God's will is. And we're very fortunate when you can see it. I think there's all kinds of things in life where we don't necessarily see what is going on. And sometimes God gives us a present that allows us to see and to understand. And as I said, that's incredible bracha. So what happens with Yosef is it's very clear to me. Again, the bigger question isn't to the ish. The bigger question is, why does the Torah write it? The Torah writes it because this is God's will. And once it's God's will, so that's a malach. What's a malach? A malach is somebody who facilitates God's will. So it could have been a man, it could have been a malach, but it doesn't make a difference because the man is a malach because he is now this emissary for God.
Right. It's weird because it always sounded to me that this ish was saying, when I heard Nasumiza, because I heard that they go from this, I heard them going to go. It sounds to me like he was saying, leave it alone, don't chase. That's the way I always hear that pasuk. That tone sounds to me like, don't pursue this. They went from here, they went to Dotan, like get on. Especially because then it says Vayelech Yosef acharav. It sounds like he's running after them. Like, I don't know.
But go back to the words you skipped. Yeah. What does the man say? Mativakesh. Right. And what does he say?
Etachai anochi mevakesh.
Wow, and that's so powerful. That's Yosef. That's what should be on his tombstone. Etachai, right? I'm looking for my brothers. That's his whole life. I'm looking for my brothers, and they never appreciate it. They never reciprocate. They never look for him.
Right. No, that's very sad. I feel like even at the end of his life, because when he finds out, when Yaakov dies and they have to make up this whole story, he seems devastated by that. Like he still hasn't gained their full acceptance as just one of them, which he wanted to be. And to me, that was always very, very sad and tragic at the end of his life.
Yeah.
Even like when they're all leaving Mitzrayim, they're all running around. I'm very touched by the fact that Moshe goes to see to it that he's taken out. Because, like the way I see it is just like everyone's going and, I just feel like it's something that still hasn't happened yet, still lingering.
Yeah. I republished my first book. It was called Explorations. I republished it as Explorations Expanded. So I added a bunch of chapters in. And one of the chapters I added in was about, how Bereshit ends and that last scene of Yosef's life. So if you get a chance, you should look at it. I think it really will give you a sense. Actually, the book ends on a happy note. But something happens. It's like the last second something happens, which turns everything around. Then you realize that we're okay. But I had to work very hard on that in order to go through that whole Yosef story. I have a lot in there, and it's worthwhile to the next couple of weeks to read those chapters. If you can't find them, then I'll find them to send them to you. You'll let me know.
Right. I guess I just want to end on a positive note somehow. It's Hanukkah tonight. And we will be lighting that first candle. I know there's big connections between Yosef. I don't know if there's more than the lighting the candle, or they get the amount from the pit and whatever. But I always feel like just that lighting that first candle is trying to begin some sort of some sort of beginning to turn that whole thing around, the source of light, that to reverse what we went through. I mean, I don't think it's any accident that these stories come at the time of Hanukkah. And so I leave it to you to give us a positive Hanukkah message before we head out.
Well, one thing about Hanukkah is that, the war itself was the Jews and the Mityavnim as well. So it was a civil war. It was Jew against Jew. So it's very interesting that Chazal said, Ner Ishu Beito, one candle for the whole house. And that's a sense of unity. Again, we need to be a whole house. The second thing, which is really interesting, instead of doing what we would have anticipated, light candles in the shuls, because that's a makom of kedusha, mikdash ma'at, and therefore, just like the Beit HaMikdash, that should be followed up in the shuls. And instead, they said no, light it by the homes. So therefore, they were pointing out that all of our homes have kedusha as well. There's holiness in the Jewish home. So I think that was also part of the takeaway. And the other thing is, I think the most important part, we always look at the miracle of Hanukkah, that they lit a candle and it lasted for 8 days, and the reality that they lit it and it lasted for 2,500 years. And we still feel that candle which was lit, and that's really what I feel that first night. I feel that Kohen Gadol lighting that in the Beit HaMikdash, and wow, could he imagine if he would have imagined that 2,500 years later we're going to leave the country and we're going to come back again and we're going to light outside our homes, not inside. We're going to light outside our homes, facing the streets and not be afraid like all the Jews all through the generations who felt forced to light them inside, and we're going to still light. And we're lighting outside, and we're and we're proud of it, and it's still going on. The Jewish homes still have holiness, and the Jews won, and the Greeks are forgotten already. So I just see this continuity from that Kohen Gadol lighting it, and really that message. And this home has to be a place which is a mikdash ma'at. So I think that's really what it is. And by the way, if we'll end on a different point by saying that's really it also to a certain extent goes back to Sarah. It's Sarah's tent. It's Sarah's tent where the Shekhinah is on top of it, where there's a bracha and the Isa. These are the mitzvot of women, including the lighting of the candles. So therefore, her candles were to last from Shabbat. But that's the Beit HaMikdash. That's really what it was saying, is that Sarah's tent is the Beit HaMikdash with the Shekhinah, with the Shnei Lechem, with the menorah. And now, when there's no Beit HaMikdash, so what happens? It goes back to the tent. It goes back to the house. And we have to go back and show that the house is a place of Kedusha. So I just see, the closing of a circle over there.
Wow, that's beautiful. Thank you very much, Rabbi Kahn.
Okay. Hanukkah Sameach.
Hanukkah Sameach. Only good things. Shabbat Shalom.
Okay. Shabbat Shalom.